So, welcome to the podcast today. Kind of a special edition. I don't know. Well, it's not really a special edition because it's still coming at you at the normal time.
It's special to us.
Special to us. So,
this is What If Geography.
This is What If Geography, the podcast. Hunter and I are fresh off of just watching the opener of the 2022 World Cup.
That's right.
Which is, spoiler, not a spoiler because...
Yeah, you can just hit pause if you haven't seen the game yet,
if
or
you
don't want to know the results. But it was a few days ago now, or maybe weeks ago, depending on when you're listening to this. Yeah, months.
It could be years.
Could be. That's right.
This episode's going to have legs, I think.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. So if just so everybody knows, Ecuador just beats Qatar 2-0 in the opening game of the World Cup. It was an exciting game. I was really pulling for Ecuador. Did you have a preference, Hunter?
In a lot of these matches, I'm just waiting to see what happens. Wanted to see a good game, and it was a solid opening match, I guess you could say, from a soccer standpoint.
Yeah, it was very entertaining. One of the announcers had said something to the tune, this was the first time that the host country had lost their home opener during the World Cup. And I think that was only partially true. Or is that fully true?
No, I think that might be true. What I was thinking of was that I think it was maybe in 2002 where Senegal beat France. And France was the defending champions at that point. That tournament was held in Japan and South Korea. So they couldn't, with an opening match, you wouldn't be able to choose between the two countries. They had to, usually it's the hosting country, I think, that opens the tournament. And in this case, or maybe that's not always true, but in this case, it was the unfavored team that won.
Yeah. And that's actually a good point, because in 2026, the U.S. will host, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada will host the World Cup.
That's right.
It'll be interesting to see who gets that opening game, or maybe that's already been decided and I have no idea.
Or maybe
I might need to turn in my soccer credential card here.
Well, no, I'm not sure. I mean, they couldn't have determined this because, they know those three countries will be in the tournament.
They know those three, and they know the cities.
But it seems to me that one of those countries might not have the opening game, because then they'd have to favor one of the others, and maybe it will be the defending champion, or maybe it'll be a different group. Yeah.
Well, and I also think I think they know where that final is going to be. I think they already announced New York.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, New York, and not the Rose Bowl or something.
Yeah, I think that was the big.
Interesting.
I think the intent was, I think the expectation that it'd be in L.A. like the 1994 World Cup.
That's right.
But geez, I mean, I don't have it right in front of me, but I really remember reading an article headline that New York was selected as the final for the World Cup, 2026 World Cup.
Things can always change, as we've seen.
Things can change, and I could also be totally wrong, and that's totally fine, because
that's all right. Nobody's perfect.
If you can't tell, we already kind of announced sort of our subject today, but we'll get to that a little bit more specifics. Let's do some quick introductions. Welcome to the What If Geography podcast. My name is Jeff Gibson. I am the co-host of this podcast, the host of the YouTube channel of the same name. A general geography nerd and city planner nerd and urbanism nerd, all that kind of stuff. And as you can probably tell, also a soccer nerd. And I'm going to throw it over to my co-host.
Yes, hello. My name is Hunter Shobe. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University and a fellow nerd on the geography front and on the soccer front. Jeff and I both have... when we talk about things on this podcast, we're not experts in most of these things. We've done a lot of research. We're very interested in these topics. So, a lot of people are listening. If you're an expert, you might be thinking, these guys don't have quite it all figured out.
They don't know at all what they're talking about.
That's right. That might be very well what people are thinking. But, we don't claim to have tons of expertise in everything we're talking about. And there are certainly people who know a lot more about soccer than we do. However, we do have some soccer expertise in both of our cases. In my case, I wrote my master's thesis and my PhD dissertation on a topic that relates to soccer. I wrote about FC Barcelona and the ways in which, FC Barcelona functions as a vehicle for the expression of urban identity in Barcelona, national identity in Catalonia, while at the same time is marketed as a global brand. So I've written a number of academic pieces on soccer. And in fact, Jeff and I have co-authored several academic pieces on soccer, and which don't deal with FC Barcelona, but deal with soccer in the United States. One of them dealt with soccer in the United States and Mexico and the rivalry there. We contributed to a book on that topic.
Yeah, and the other one being a more of an article on regional identity specific to the Pacific Northwest, or maybe like locally known as Cascadia.
That's right.
And sort of how that had blossomed, at least in the early years of the 2010s, through soccer, right? Through the Portland Timbers, through the Seattle Sounders, through the Vancouver Whitecaps.
We argued that that was one of the ways in which people knew about this region, and that people celebrated or promoted the idea that it should be recognized as a region.
Yeah, which makes sense, because if you still go to, if you're in this area, or if you're a fan of MLS and you watch it on TV, and you see a game, really with any of the three teams, and eventually it'll pan over to the supporters groups, because for obvious reasons, you'll see at least a couple of the Cascadia flags flying right through the stands, right? So it is definitely a way for people to talk about their identity with respect to their locations.
Yeah, particularly in a country like the United States, which is a big country in terms of population and in land area. It's pretty large, and so there are a lot of regions that have a lot of regional identity attached to them, and people like to promote those in different ways. And popular culture is one way of doing that. Sport is one way of doing that. And so we highlighted some of the ways in which soccer was a venue for the expression of something called Cascadia.
Yeah. And then just to add a little bit more onto that, in terms of my background with soccer and writing and everything like that, I founded the SB Nation website. It wasn't always an SB Nation website, but they took it over, called Stumptown Footy, that is still running today, and I still read it today. But I founded that back in 2010, I think, maybe even 2009, is when I actually started my own sort of blog, covering the Portland Timbers. Just very excited sort of at that time around Portland, getting an MLS team, and being a writer myself, just wanting to contribute to the coverage of that. So that was really fun. I sort of ran that website until 2013, and I got to, meet all the players, got to meet Diego Valeri, a personal sort of soccer hero of mine. And it was just a really fun time. I had to leave it, but I'm happy to see that still going on. And
that's great. That's the legacy.
That's the legacy. So if you couldn't tell, Hunter and I very passionate about today's subject. It's going to be a fun one. This will definitely be a two-parter. So if you're listening to this, you're listening to part one. As always, we'll try and do a recap in part two before, so that way you're not coming in too confused about what we're talking about. But let's kind of get to, I guess, quick caveat before we get into today's topic.
Yes.
If you're not a sports fan, you might have a very strong urge to click that stop button and not sort of continue on. And I'm going to make an argument for why you should continue listening right now.
Let's hear it.
Today's subject is broadly about the World Cup and sort of the sport of soccer at large. But you're probably listening to this chiefly because you're a geography fan. At least I would hope so. You find this sort of concept interesting. And I think there's enough in this episode to compel you to stick around, because really sport, even if you're not interested in sport, you're not interested in sort of, the whatever team versus whatever team and the outcome of that, whatever. There's a lot of ways to look at the world through the lens of sport that I think is very interesting and very telling about how we identify ourselves, how we culturally, what culturally binds us. If you're not interested at all in soccer, I think this is still a good episode for you to listen to, because it can be some very interesting topics.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And in a lot of ways, certainly this is a topic and an episode that relates to sport. But in a larger sense, it's about culture more broadly. And it's about how to look at the world and the way that the world comes together and has agreement and conflict through different aspects of culture or popular culture. Right. Yeah. And this is just one particular lens. So it's really an example of how we can look at the world through something other than state politics, for example, which do figure pretty prominently in this. But yeah, I think you're right that, we're not going to be talking about the finer points of the offsides rule, for example. I mean, that's not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about the way that people negotiate local and global culture through something that is popular throughout different parts of the world. That's what popular culture is.
Right. You're not going to, aside from what I guess we already covered because we just coming off that first game, we're not going to talk about scores. We're not going to talk about, the glory of this team versus that team, right? We're not this is not a sports podcast, and this won't be a traditionally sports-based episode. This is still a geography podcast. So
that's true. We might have to remind ourselves of that one for once in a while, but I think that the bulk of this will be appealing to people who normally sports isn't their main thing.
Exactly. So with that said, Hunter, you want to introduce more specifically what our topic is?
So our topic today is, and again, on the heels of the opening of the 2022 World Cup, what if there was no World Cup? What if the World Cup didn't exist?
Which seems almost like if you're sort of not all that attuned to the World Cup or sports in general, right? It's just not something you really keep track of, which a lot of people just don't really care about sports, and that's totally fine.
You'd be like nothing, whatever.
Right. Yeah. It'd be like, okay, like I wouldn't have to hear about it in my social media feed every 4 years, or I wouldn't have to know the very minor blip of, news headline that comes through. To you, the impact would be very negligible.
But there's a broader impact, I think, and there's a lot that we could talk about how the world might be a little bit different in some ways, not just the sporting world, but the world of culture, the world of politics, the world of economics, if there was no World Cup. So that's where we're heading to, and we're going to kind of weave our way there by talking about some of the background with the sport and with the event itself. But the first thing I think that I want to address is a question of terminology. Because the sport that we've already been referring to as soccer, some people might be listening to this, and if you're from certain parts of the world, you're thinking you're already wrong. Because the soccer is not even a thing. It's called football. Mm-hmm. And so let's address this difference between calling the sport soccer and calling the sport football. And we're going to call it soccer here because in the country that we're situated in, and in a few other countries, it is called soccer. And in fact, in the United Kingdom and in England, as part of the United Kingdom, soccer was a term that was used to describe this sport at certain times. And we'll get into some of the history about how this sport was established and codified. Mm-hmm. But when it was first established, what we're calling soccer and a lot of people call football was called association football.
Right.
And that was used to make it distinct from another sport that today is called rugby. And so rugby and soccer, as we'll talk about in a little bit, really come from the first prototypical pre-industrial sport called folk football. Mm-hmm. But association football at one point, and from the research I'm looking at, circa the 1880s, was shortened to either association football to A-soccer or ASOC.
Exactly.
And this was done by apparently University of Oxford students who are known for developing nicknames for things. And that rugby was called rugger. And so this is something that stuck for a while. And eventually, as soccer or football and rugby become different things, rugby is known as rugby, and then association football becomes known as football. But it was apparently through the 1980s that in Britain, it wasn't completely uncommon to call what is called football there, to call it soccer once in a while. And it was really a term that stopped being used because all of a sudden they realized that it was people from the United States and a few other countries that were calling it soccer. And they didn't want to be associated with that. They wanted it to be a separate thing. So already, and we're just starting this, and this has to do with nationalism based on the terminology and the language that we're using. I think it's important to point out that not only in the United States, but in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland, I believe it's common for this sport to be called soccer. Mm-hmm. And it's because there's other sports that have developed that they need to distinguish it from. So in the United States, it's something that here is just called football. At one point it was called gridiron football, which is a term that's we don't use so much anymore. In Canada, a very similar sport it emerged, and it's Canada's version of gridiron football. And in many parts of the world, I think that sport is called American football.
Right.
But in Australia, there's Australian rule football. In Ireland, there's Gaelic football. And so there needed to be a way to distinguish between these sports. And that's one of the reasons that soccer really stuck in some of these countries over the term football.
Right. So I think going back to the Rugby being called ruggers, you say? Ruggers?
I think it was called rugger at one
Rugger?
point,
Rugger?
but I think quickly became rugby instead of
yeah.
football.
But it was like almost like rugger versus soccer. Rugger, like, right? You can see how like the language definitely evolved and adapted to the needs at the time, right? Especially because, association football is a clunky term.
It's a long term.
It's a long term, right?
This is a sport that's played at universities, so it wouldn't be surprising that young people coming up with a new nickname for something that's not a new thing, and that name sticks more broadly throughout the culture.
Right. And then you get to, like you said, you get to the 80s, and all of a sudden, I would say even more particular, the association of associated football, the association of the word soccer with the United States, a historically soccer, football, whatever you want to call it, illiterate country, definitely a huge driving point towards calling it football again from the English perspective.
And you might say, well, why late 70s, 1980s? It's because the North American Soccer League, which was the earlier incarnation of professional soccer in the United States, had its heyday in the 1970s. So that has to tie into this.
It has to tie into it. Yeah. So all that's to say is the language here, the geographic language, the differences in the language is a key point to almost a us versus them or an othering type of quality, right? It's
a way of placing where you are.
Exactly, right?
And where this conversation is happening.
And so I think it's very interesting, if we're now in, obviously we're now in 2022, the U.S. has become more soccer literate. I wouldn't say it's, definitely a high level, certainly not the same level as, Brazil or Argentina or, a lot of European countries, for example.
But it's not unpopular here.
But it's not unpopular anymore,
we hear that the number one sport in which youth participate in the United States happens to be soccer. So maybe professionally it's not as popular as American football or baseball, but certainly popular.
But I mean, and certainly popular enough to where, Major League Soccer, right there in the name, right? Of our professional league is, earning billions of dollars on TV contracts now. And their players are being paid millions of dollars, right? So it's like, it's firmly, solidified itself within the United States cultural sort of sports landscape.
And that's for men and women.
That's for men and women, right?
That's
the National Women's Soccer League also now has a nationally televised contract with, CBS and has cemented itself now as the longest running women's soccer league and has become very popular. And we can talk a little bit more about women's soccer in general. But I think the point I'm just trying to make now is that going back to the language, if you talk to certain fans of the sport here in the U.S., they have started to try to gravitate away from the term soccer as well, to starting to say football. And these would typically be people who I think would more commonly follow a European league, the English Premier League, for example, very popular in the U.S. And that ties a lot into sort of the globalization of the sport and how the sport has been able to grow with globalization and all the new technology we have to be able to follow sport. And so obviously if you're a U.S. fan, you just love the sport at large, you probably would want to watch the quote unquote the best soccer that's available to you. In which case that's probably not going to be Major League Soccer. I love the Portland Timbers. I won't tell anybody that the Portland Timbers are the best team in the world.
However, we're talking about women's soccer. The United States is one of the top leagues easily in the world, and Portland Thorns, champions of
the NWSL,
arguably one of the best soccer teams in the world.
I would argue that for women's soccer, I would argue the NWSL is definitely the best league in the world. I would argue that none of the teams in NWSL are the best team in the world. I would think Olympique Lyonnais is one of the best teams in the
Barcelona
world.
Right now. I think Chelsea, there's some clubs there, but that's been a fairly recent development. But certainly the point is that we're attentive to our audience. And when I'm writing academic stuff about this sport that we're talking about today, and if it's going to have more of a global audience, I'm referring to it as football in the articles. However, most of, the bulk of our audience is going to be in the United States and some of these other countries where soccer is a term. And so we're going to use the term soccer.
Right. So for this podcast, we're broadly going to be using the term soccer. I'm going to have an article up on my Substack that I'll launch on Monday, where I will be using the word soccer outside of the appropriate abbreviation of FIFA, right? Which has football right in it. So
that's right.
Because that's who our audience is, and I actually, again, like going back to, like, a lot of Americans who got into the sport seem to feel a lot of shame towards that word. I actually don't have any shame towards it. I actually kind of like it. It's
it is what it is.
It is what it is.
I think that people will say you're wrong. It's not what it is, and I say, yeah, you're right from your perspective. It would not be right to call it that in particular countries, but when we're talking about this sport in the United States, it just makes sense.
It makes more sense. Yeah. Overall. Okay. So, are we done with the language thing?
I think so for now. Yeah.
Okay. So we're already about 21 minutes in, which means our favorite time of every episode is
short break time,
which is also a key for you, listener, to listen to all of these wonderful ads and these products and these services that are going to be flowing your way to help support this podcast. So,
but we'll be right back.
Thanks. Welcome back.
We're back.
We are back. Hopefully, I do listen to these podcasts. It's a little bit of a tangent. I listen to these like on my own sort of app, and so I listen to the ads that come through. There's some bizarre ones that go through.
Aren't they different though at different times, or does it matter on the service, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I have no idea how ads are served.
And they might be different next week or something, right?
Well, so they are. Yeah, they can definitely be different. I've definitely heard a lot of. I've heard some casinos, like online casinos, which is like, do I want that advertising on my podcast?
Yeah, the point here is that we're starting a new podcast and we don't have a lot of control over this.
We have no control.
So we're trying to reflect upon that critically in some way.
Yeah. So, anyways, let's just get back to the topic at hand.
Yeah, let's do that.
I only wanted to bring that up because you just listened to some ads, so we have no power in that. But let's get back to the World Cup. So, before we jump into the topic at large, we're recording this on the day of the very first episode of the 2022 World Cup.
Right, the 22nd FIFA recognized World Cup for men.
22nd. And when you're listening to this, it'll be day 4. That'll be Wednesday. If you didn't know, shocker, we don't record these the same day we publish them. That shouldn't be a surprise, but maybe it is. So we're a little bit behind the schedule, but I think it's worthwhile before we get into the World Cup. We just kind of have to address the elephant in the room, right? Which is Qatar, or as a lot of people pronounce it as Qatar.
Maybe I'll pronounce it that way and you pronounce it that way, just to sort of...
You know what's weird is, like, I used to pronounce it Qatar as well, and then like I heard it spoken by, I think it was like an interview with somebody from Qatar.
Okay.
And they pronounced it Qatar, and I was like, oh, I need to like internalize that.
Right.
And now every time I say it, everybody's like, what is that? What are you talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a sound that we might not be able to quite replicate because it doesn't exist in English, that exists in Arabic. But yeah, what we're talking about is there's been no shortage of attention drawn to the fact that there's a bunch of controversies around this particular country hosting the World Cup.
Right. So let's go back in time a little bit to, I believe it was 2012. I could be wrong on my dates, but basically
2010 or 2012.
2010 maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Basically when they decided, like at this point, 10 or 12 years ago, they decided when the 2018 and 2022 World Cups, who was going to host them.
Which, first of all, is the first time in history that FIFA had ever announced two at the same time,
right.
And they haven't done that again. So that was already kind of a strange moment.
Yeah, and if you didn't know, hosting a World Cup is a very competitive process. It means a lot to the country that's hosting it. There's a lot of cultural identity that's poured into it. There's a lot of money that gets poured into it, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But to host a World Cup tournament is almost it's sacred, right? It's sort of seen as like a momentous occasion for whatever country.
Well, it's a moment to really promote a place in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just a small reminder that a country hosts the World Cup, but a city hosts the Olympics.
Exactly.
So there is a little bit of a difference.
And we've started to see, and boy, we're going to get into the Olympics later, so stay tuned for that.
That's true.
But, we've started to see the shine wear off on hosting the Olympics, right?
Both sports or both events, there seems to be reluctance at times to host this event and one of the reasons is because there's this perception that it's going to benefit the country or the city, in the case of the Olympics, enormously by hosting this. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not exactly the case, that there's an enormous amount of expense, there's a lot of disruption, and so countries still want to host it, but maybe there's not as much glamour involved as there was in the past.
Right. And so I think we've definitely seen the shine wear off on hosting the Olympics when a single city is having to commit billions of dollars to quote unquote sort of have the pleasure of hosting the whatever Olympics it is, winter or summer. We're starting to see the World Cup. There's generally less competition. If you didn't know, we already talked about it a little bit, so you should know, but 2026, it'll be the US, Canada, and Mexico. So it'll be the first time that 3 countries are co-hosting it. It is predominantly hosted by the US, but there are definitely games going to be held in Mexico and Canada, respectively. That's right. Because it's a momentous effort. And if we look at, but just before we even get into Qatar, however you pronounce it, before we even get into them hosting it, and sort of what's going on within their country and sort of their geographic stance within the world, I think it's worth highlighting that if we go back to 1994 when the U.S. hosted the 1994 World Cup,
that's right.
The broad estimate for how much the U.S. spent was about $500 million.
Okay.
And if we track that up, to France and then into Japan and South Korea hosted 2002, and then Germany 2006, and South Africa 2010, and Brazil, it's generally ticked up, right? So I think France was somewhere around $2 billion, and there was like somewhere between like $2 and like $6 billion for each country, right? I think South Africa was a little bit lower on that end. The estimates right now for how much Qatar has spent to host this World Cup is sitting at $220 billion.
Is that right?
Yes.
I didn't realize it was that high.
Yes. I mean, so I read multiple articles about that. There's even on a website called Statista, which is basically a repository for statistics of all kinds of things. So they do a lot of their own research. They really put the effort in, and I think that's where a lot of this is coming from, that they are estimated to have spent $220 billion to basically, because they've had to build whole cities.
Well, I mean, this is the point that we have to make right now, which is that FIFA, which is the governing body of international soccer, of global soccer, has the right to award this to a particular country.
Right.
And once a country is awarded the rights to host the World Cup, that country then starts spending money on everything that needs to happen in terms of infrastructure, in terms of stadiums. FIFA doesn't spend money on that. They promote the tournament, but the expense goes to the country and not to the organization that is awarding the rights to host this tournament.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think all that's to say is, again, we'll get into Qatar as a country a little bit because I think it's an important thing to cover as we're talking about the World Cup. But Qatar didn't have much infrastructure in general to host this kind of tournament.
Well, so
they had one city, Doha, there. And really quick, I just want to talk very quickly about the population of Qatar, which is really only about 500,000 people who are actually citizens of Qatar. And we'll talk about that a little bit later because that's not the full picture.
This is a country the size of Connecticut, apparently.
Yeah, very small. It's
right.
and less population than Connecticut.
That's right.
In terms of official population. So
citizenship. Yep.
In terms of citizenship. So I think at this point, let's talk a little bit more about who Qatar is and why they are even hosting a World Cup when it sort of seems to fly in the face of the logistics aspect.
Well, so one thing is that for a number of years, the World Cup was really switching between Europe and South America.
Right.
And no other part of the world had hosted the World Cup, which for a tournament called the World Cup started to become a problem.
Right.
And then eventually another part of the world, in this case, North America, I think it was probably Mexico was the first one to host it outside of Europe or South America. That was in 1970. The United States in 1994, and then Japan, South Korea in 2022. Then went back to Europe and Germany in 2006. And the idea was we have to bring this tournament to someplace else in the world. And there kind of was the conventional wisdom that someplace in Africa should be hosting this tournament at that point. And there were, I think, 5 different candidates that were vying for the hosting rights, and it was South Africa that was granted the rights at that time, which was seen as controversial as well.
Right.
Because
FIFA is nothing but controversial.
There's nothing but controversy involved there. And again, when we're talking about a government having to spend resources for sport, when there are lots of other things that could be spent on, which include, education and healthcare and infrastructure and raising the status of the impoverished, it does become pretty tricky to talk about spending all this money on stadiums and things like that. And you were talking about the infrastructure from Qatar, and we'll swing back to that for a second. There are 8 stadiums that are being used there, and that's the fewest number, I think, recently. Brazil had to build a number of stadiums they didn't want to build, and that's a whole nother thing.
I think they had to build 12, or they had 12.
They wanted to have 8, and they had to have 12. They had to build several, including one in Manaus, which is not being used for anything else, which doesn't have a top level Brazilian soccer club in it. But 6 of the stadiums for this World Cup in Qatar have been built expressly for this World Cup. And one of them apparently is going to be disassembled as soon as the tournament is over and brought to some other places of the world. Again, I guess it's a generous sort of idea to develop sport in other places, but these are probably places in the world that would like to have other kinds of development,
right?
In addition to new soccer facilities.
Yeah, I think that's it's almost like it's a greenwashing or whitewashing of sort of.
I've heard
their
sports
image,
washing.
Right? Sports washing.
Yeah,
sports
this
washing.
is a term now.
Yeah, so it's a sports washing of right. So. I guess let's just kind of get into it. Qatar is, if nothing, a very controversial country. So this is a country that's in Southwest Asia. I guess more commonly referred to as the Middle East, but we're geographers here, so we're going to use the term Southwest Asia. That was up until January 1st, 2019, an OPEC nation. So they are a oil-producing, oil-funded country, right? So there's already that hitch in a world that's increasingly is trying to get off of fossil fuels. What does it say when we host basically one of the world's grandest tournaments? In fact, it might be the grandest tournament at this point, to a country that is making all of its money and is being able to fund itself and all of everything that we're experiencing these next 2.5 weeks, through oil, right?
Well, we could easily point a finger at most of the countries that have hosted the World Cup before and talk about the way that they've earned their wealth. So
that's a good point, right? Like that's not to say that other countries don't have, right? If you look at the U.S., right, obviously U.S.'s wealth is
a lot of critiques could be
a
made.
lot of critiques can be.
I think there's been a number of big lightning bolt issues, and one of them has been the treatment and situation for migrant workers in Qatar. And things are apparently changing, but there have not been a lot of protections for workers there. The exit visa thing, where you're not even allowed to leave the country because the employer is going to control whether this person has their passport in their own possession or not. There's been a lot made about people who have died working on the stadiums for the World Cup. And then that's just a microcosm of the larger thing, which is there are many migrant workers who have died working on infrastructure just in the country overall. And, there are accidents that happen in construction in different places, but not at the level that it's been happening in Qatar. And that has been one of the big reasons that people have said, this doesn't feel right.
Right. So I think, let's just name it because there's an official name. It's called the kafala system. So the kafala system is basically exactly what Hunter just said. It is a system where a migrant worker will move to Qatar in some fashion to work on some sort of infrastructure project. And that can be the World Cup stadium. It can also very likely be a new building that's going into town. It could be whatever that they feel like they have a need for. And that is a system where your employer holds your passport. Right. So you are now subject to your freedom, right? You can't go back to your home country unless your employer basically says you are allowed to leave. Now, this system officially ended in 2016. Qatar had sort of made some sort of grand proclamation based on all the criticisms that they were going to end it. However, unofficially, apparently most, or I don't know about most, but a lot of employers, particularly around the World Cup stadiums, have been still using it. And if we talk about largely where these migrant workers are coming from, it gets kind of interesting, right? So a lot of them are coming from Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, right? So there's a geography here.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a geography of wealth and where people are moving to in order to build wealth to send back to their families because their home countries don't offer the same kind of opportunities. Right. And we talked about this sort of economic inside our No Borders episodes, right? We talked about why people move, right? And it's primarily for economic means.
That's the main reason that people move throughout the world. And again, we have to just circle back once again. There are huge inequalities in every country that has ever hosted a World Cup before, but this is not an either or thing. This is a continuum. And so the critiques have been that it's so far to one side of the continuum that the inequities, inequalities, the lack of freedom and control is so severe in this case that all this attention has been put on this issue.
Yeah. And so if we go back to, if you remember a few minutes ago, or I don't know how long ago it was, but I had mentioned that the official citizen sort of population of Qatar was about 500,000, about 500,000. But the actual amount of people who live there is, I think, around 6 million people. So
most of the people who are living there don't have the full rights that the minority who are citizens have. The minority of the population is what I mean by statistic minority.
Which I don't have any, I don't know off the top of my head, but I can't imagine there's a lot of countries that have that same sort of disparity.
There are a couple other cases in Southwest Asia.
Yeah, probably United Arab Emirates, maybe.
Right,
I don't know.
Right.
I'm not trying to throw the United Arab Emirates under a bus here. I'm just maybe a like area.
Well, that was true at one point before the global economy, took its downturn in 2008 or something like that. I know that in the UAE that there were more people there who were, the population more than doubled with migrant workers, in other words.
Yeah. And so all that's to say is that the Qatar is definitely a special issue in that it's hosting, again, the tournament of that's sort of like, for lack of a better sort of, I think the closest we would get is the Olympics, but for lack of a better sort of comparison is sort of the World's Tournament, right? It's really the only other location that, the only other tournament that really highlights a lot of different countries in this very particular and unique way every 4 years, is now hosting, is now able to host without having a lot of the infrastructure, without having a lot of the same population, without having a lot of the even the history of the sport.
Right. And there's an argument that I've heard certainly that this is a country that without a huge background in this particular sport of soccer, and that's
which I don't necessarily agree
I
with.
think, because I think we were just looking at this and that there's the professional league there has been going on since I think the 1970s. The current league, there are teams that have been in operation for longer than that, longer than the United States, for example, which is about to host or co-host its second World Cup.
And the United States hosted in 1994.
That's right.
Which is sort of what launched our own home league today that we have today. Right?
That's right.
So, I don't necessarily agree with the history. They don't have the history of the sport, therefore that they're not worthy of it. But I do think it's something that people call out.
We could certainly argue that they play in the Asian football conference,
Confederation.
Confederation.
Asian Football Confederation,
right. AFC.
Yeah.
And there are many countries who have been more active and have qualified for World Cups that would perhaps be eligible and their governments wanting to host. And that's another way of thinking about that. It's that, well, what other countries in the region or in Asia would want to host this tournament, and why weren't they chosen, for example?
Yeah.
Or why was their candidacy not advanced? Another thing that has received a lot of criticism, and I think rightly so, is the LGBTQ rights, or the lack of rights for LGBTQ, and that's a huge issue as well, and it's a big problem.
Yeah, well, I think it's generally for that region. it's just a very big problem, right? It's still very illegal. It's very
it's straight up illegal.
yeah. And like, I mean, I don't know about Qatar specifically, whether it's just prison time or what have you. There are some countries where it's still death.
Right. And not that there aren't issues with this in other parts of the world, including the United States as well. But if we're talking about this in terms of a continuum, that it's pretty far on the one side of the continuum. And so there's been a lot of critique that, here's an entire group of people who really don't have equal rights.
Right.
And, how right is that to host a tournament in a place like that? That's been the critique.
Right. A tournament that is, I mean, if you go back and look at, FIFA tournaments, in the last, few decades, they're always trying to promote this image of inclusiveness and, anti-racism and like all this kind of stuff. It's the world's game. It's for everybody. It's supposed to be, all inclusive. And yet that's not to take away from, when they award it to, whatever country, right? Those countries have their issues as well. But when you award it to a country that's still on its books, has it as being illegal to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, trans, however you identify yourself, what is that saying in terms of what is okay in terms of the World Cup, right? How much money really?
Yeah, how complacent is the rest of the world and we're watching it, right? So we're watching this tournament and there's corporations who are sponsoring it and some have spoken out, but ultimately this is going on and that suggests that that's somehow okay.
Yeah.
And that's been a part of this. And, we might ask at this point to eventually start to veer towards the question of the day. Well, maybe we shouldn't have these things in the first place.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's really funny that you brought up the sponsors, not to take away from the sort of the gravitas of the LGBTQ issue. But typically sponsors for the World Cup have had I would say an undue amount of power over dictating what is going to be allowed or not going to be allowed. It's not even about not being allowed, but what is going to be allowed. So if we go back to Brazil in 2014, I believe, Brazil historically has had a lot of issues around quote unquote hooliganism, sort of, gangs that form around being, very passionate about your soccer fans, which leads to a lot of negative sort of effects.
Supporter groups that are conflated with violent activity.
Right, exactly. And so Brazil for a long time had banned the sale of alcohol in its stadiums. And they had wanted to keep that law in place for the World Cup. Now, if you didn't know, listener, Budweiser has basically been the primary beer sponsor, I think maybe the only beer sponsor of the World Cup for the last 20 plus years. And so they mandated to FIFA to allow beer sales within stadiums for the obvious reason.
It was FIFA who demanded that, in other words. Oh, no,
I think Budweiser
said that if we're going to continue this relationship and pay all this money to FIFA to be a corporate sponsor, this is the way it's going to have to run.
Exactly. Like they want, to their point, right? They're going to spend a lot of money to be a sponsor of this thing, right? They're going to want their product to be sold in the stadiums where they can make money, right? I think that is just whatever your takes on capitalism, that's the handshake
the way
agreement.
The system works.
That's how it works. And so FIFA forced Brazil to do that, and Brazil acquiesced, and beer was allowed to be sold in stadiums, and I don't know if there's any issues around that, and I'm not going to touch on that, but I think what's been most interesting and most pertinent to the conversation we're having now about Qatar is that beer. So Qatar announced back in 2019, 2020 that beer was going to be sold in stadiums because the exact same issue that Budweiser's one of the biggest sponsors of the tournament. And then as of like a week or two ago, Qatar announced no alcohol was going to be sold in the stadiums unless you were in a luxury box. So basically anybody who's inside the stands was not allowed to buy alcohol. Again, rightfully or wrongfully, I'm not here to make that
and
argument.
This is not on the level of the other things that we're talking about, right? This is not the same anywhere. This has nothing to do with the migrant workers, LGBTQ rights. This is a sideline to that.
But I think it goes to show the power of Qatar as a country and sort of where if we go back to what I was originally stating about how much money they've invested in hosting this, right? If we go back to, the U.S. and everybody, a few $1 billion a piece, and Qatar, $220 billion is the estimate now. And I think it goes back to show just how much power and leverage they have over FIFA in terms of just pure dollars, right? And I think that to me was the clearest highlight of, a country like Brazil, which is intrinsically, historically, very much tied to the sport in almost every feasible way.
Has more World Cup championships than any other country.
They have 5, right? They've won 5 times. Always a really good team. People are very passionate about the sport. And then you have Qatar, which, again, that's not to say they don't have any history with the sport. They do, but maybe not as intrinsically linked to the sport as a country like Brazil is able to flex and get FIFA, an organization that is historically not bent to the will of their hosts, is able to do that. And I think that says a lot. I think that right there says a lot about the tournament, FIFA, and FIFA's relationship to Qatar, which, by the way, Qatar, basically their crown prince, or I think it's called the Qatar Foundation, owns Paris Saint-Germain, one of the biggest clubs in Europe. So there's just a lot at play here for how much that country is able to dictate to FIFA what they're going to do and what they're not going to
That's
allow
right.
that other countries can't and have not been able to do.
And I think that, walking away from this, there will be a lot of people who, I'll just repeat what I said a few minutes ago, that are going to question the legitimacy of having tournaments like this in the first place.
Yeah. So, and I just have one more quick point, because I feel like we're wrapping up on our 2022 World Cup, but the other sort of weird geographic aspect of this tournament and Qatar in general is this this thing that they've sort of tried to do over the last couple of decades, which is the naturalization of players.
Okay.
And so, if you didn't know, listener, in order to play for your national team, you have to have some sort of intrinsic tie to that country, which typically means, one, you're obviously a citizen, and that'll be a sticking point in a minute. But now today, you also have some sort of historic link to that country as well. So you can't just, I'm a 25-year-old who's really good at soccer, and I'm born in the U.S. and I've always lived in the U.S. I've never been to, let's say, Germany, but Germany sees me and says, "You look like you're a really good soccer player."
We're describing a highly unlikely scenario, by the way.
We're describing a highly unlikely scenario, but you're a really good soccer player, so we're just going to give you citizenship, and you're going to come play for us. That's
right, because that's happened before, and FIFA's not like that very much. I mean, it used to be, if you go back into, for example, the 1950s, you could have played for the senior team, which just means the highest, ranking, or the top national side in one country, and then switch allegiances.
Right.
And so there have been many cases of this, or several high-profile cases of this happening before. That's changed now. So you can come up through the youth system, and you can play for the national under 19 or under 20 team, or something like that, and then become part of exercise your citizen rights in another country and play for that country. But once you've played a competitive match for a particular country, then you're linked to that country in the world of soccer.
You're locked to them.
That's right. You can't switch.
But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because it used to be, so long as you weren't locked to a country, you could just get naturalized and you could play for that country. And the reason why this changed is because of Qatar. So Qatar back in the early 2000s was naturalizing basically a few different Brazilian players that they liked and having them play for their team. These Brazilian players otherwise did not have any ties, any links, did not spend any time in the country of Qatar. And therefore, FIFA, this was prior to Qatar having sort of the amount of influence they do have today, changed their rules to say, okay, now you have to have some sort of tie to that country. And that can be through a youth system, right? And so that's now how Qatar is also still getting around, is they've established a youth system where they'll bring in players from around the world into Qatar.
Once you've lived there for a number of years,
you've lived there, and then
you can
naturalize
establish
them.
some legitimate connection in the eyes of FIFA.
Right. And so it becomes this weird geography of players, right? Where, again, a country the size of Qatar, 500,000 sort of official citizens, is just by the nature of how many people who live there is not going to have a whole lot of development of players, right? The best teams in the world, if you're looking at Brazil, you're looking at England, you're looking at Germany, these are all like rightfully, like they've had a lot of infrastructure. They also have tens of millions of people living in there. So just by nature of how many people there are, there's going to be people, as long as you have the infrastructure and the will, they're going to develop.
And they're wealthy.
And they're wealthy, right? Well, Brazil, I wouldn't classify as like a wealthy country. I mean, they're not.
There's wealth in Brazil, but it's not experienced
yeah.
by everybody in the countries. I mean, there's no country in which
Yeah.
everybody experiences it.
Right.
But well, there's one other thing before we end on the 2022 thing that we almost forgot to talk about, which is that it's November and
Right.
there's a World Cup going on. And this is always an event that's happened in the summer.
Always
and
been a summer
when
tournament.
the award was given to Qatar originally, that was still the plan, was to have it in the summer. There was no talking about, I mean, when this was granted that, okay, yeah, well, you can have this tournament and you'll have it in the winter. And certainly the top European soccer leagues were not really hearing any talk of that because it comes right in the middle of their domestic season.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, after a while, it became clear that it was going to be completely unviable to host matches with athletes competing and fans hanging out in these temperatures that would be typical in the summer in Qatar. And so they moved the tournament to the winter.
Right. Yeah. So there's a geography of weather at play here too.
So there's this issue, and that has
Of climate.
maybe speaks a little bit to the power of the relationship between Qatar and FIFA, that because they could have taken it away. Right?
They could have taken it away.
That's
and
a thing. They could do that.
if I
FIFA
remember-
can do with that if it wants.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, when Qatar won this, they won it under the auspices that they would build air-conditioned stadiums. It was not
Open air conditioned
air-conditioned stadiums, right? And so that it was not,
which I think they have some of right
Yeah.
now as well. Anyways,
so it was not ever. They didn't bid on this with the intention of it being a winter.
That's correct.
Or I guess an autumn tournament. But again, I think it just to hammer on this point, I think it goes to show the undue amount of influence and power that Qatar has on FIFA at this moment. That's probably tied a lot to the amount of money, the pure amount of money that Qatar has, which is a lot. I mean, they have a lot of money.
well, and FIFA is technically a nonprofit organization, but that doesn't mean that it can't make as much money as it possibly can try to.
Right. It doesn't mean any of the people running it have to be nonprofit.
That's right. That's right. It doesn't relate to that. And so a lot of controversies surrounded that. But that probably is good for
I think
talking
that's
about
good. Yeah.
talking about this particular sort of situating our topic and what's happening today.
Today. Yeah. I'm sure we're listening to this 2 years from now, then it'll be a good reminiscing of
That's right.
the
A moment,
what it was.
a moment in time.
Moment in time. Okay. So, well, let's do, I think it's ads time.
Okay.
Let's do some ads. We're gonna play you some products and services. Again, we don't know who they are. But hopefully you listen to them, and we will be right back. Welcome back. We just got finished talking a lot about the 2022 World Cup and all the geographic ramifications in there, just because it's such a hot topic. But now let's get into sort of the sport at large, right? There's a lot. Soccer is, for lack of a better sort of term, it is the world sport for a reason.
It is the most widely viewed. The World Cup is the most widely viewed sporting event on the planet.
Yeah.
And that's for the men's World Cup. Women's soccer is one of the, if not the fastest growing sport in the world from a viewership standpoint. So both on the men's and the women's side, this is a sport that has an enormous amount of global attention.
Right.
And to give a little bit of context here, if you want to go back in history in pre-industrial times, there are traditions throughout different parts of the world and places where a sport that you play with the ball where you can't touch it with your hands has happened. And so that we track association soccer, as we've been talking about before, soccer or football, through the UK, through England. But there have been competitions in Italy, on the Italic Peninsula, in China, in the Mayan civilization, where they're not all the same, but there have been games that have had
They have similarities.
pretty strong similarities.
Strong similarities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Strong similarities where the main thing was that you're playing the game mostly with different parts of your body other than your hands, and it's using some kind of ball. And if we look specifically for a moment at the way that this sport emerged in pre-industrial England and pre-industrial Britain,
which I think, if you didn't know, I think the England liked to say that they invented the sport,
right?
Which maybe they sort of had a hand in sort of what it looks like and feels like today inside our more specific what we play today.
But there are people in other parts of the world who could rightly argue that's not exactly
right.
true.
And I think it goes so if you, again, just to contextualize this for a lot of the Americans who are probably listening to this, if you look at our sports, hockey, basketball, football, American football, I should say, and baseball.
Hockey's a Canadian sport.
Well, was it invented in Canada, or
I believe, yeah, I think that we got better.
Basketball might have been invented in Canada too.
I think that was a Massachusetts thing.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Naismith.
But the point I'm trying to make is that these sports all required a certain amount of infrastructure that make it hard for a sport to develop naturally, organically across multiple different regions, sort of at the same time or at different times, but without any influence on each other. If you look at soccer, it is a ball and then 2 endpoints, right? That's really all it takes. And so it's not hard to conceive of how that sport could have developed in a lot of different ways and a lot of different variations, really without there being a single point of origin.
Right. Well, I think that the way that the argument goes that England is the origin of soccer goes because the rules for the sport that became soccer today, or football, or association football, was codified in England in 1863.
Right.
And so that it gives us the trajectory to the sport that we play today. Now in Italy, they still call it calcio, which is a sport that emerged in pre-industrial Italy. But the way that the proto sport to rugby and soccer originated in England was something that's sometimes called folk football. And it probably wasn't just one game, but it was a series of different kinds of games.
Minor variations here and there, right?
And it's sort of very different from the sport that we would look at today. And it was a situation where I think apparently would involve different individuals from different cities or towns or villages. And the idea would be to get the ball from one neutral spot to one city or the other. And there would be the kinds of things that we think about as super typical to the sport today. For example, a set time length. So that wasn't part of it at the time. There was very little separation between participants and observers. There were no real rules. It was a very violent sport. Tackling, and sort of physical violence was part of this as well.
Which we kind of see through rugby in America.
Yeah, we see that sort of tackling kind of thing. And that this was generated so much distrust among the ruling class because they didn't like seeing the masses of people engaging this kind of thing because it kind of made them nervous. And so one of the things that's really interesting to appreciate is that the codification of a sport like soccer and starting to give it a time limit, starting to create boundaries where there is a clear delineation between those who are participating and those who are watching, very much has to do with the sort of logic that arose with industrialization and capitalism. And soon you start to charge admission and all these kinds of things, and it starts to go from an amateur to a professional sport. And the tension between amateurism and professionalism was a really big part of what was happening with the sport in the 1800s. In the United States, we had that today with football, college sports.
Yeah, right. Well, with more specifically with American football, right?
That's right.
Started out as like a college sport. It was very amateur.
And that was part of the spirit of it, is that these are not professionals and they shouldn't be paid. And as it goes, people start to want to win, and they start to pay people who are really good at it to become ringers, as we would call them today. And so this tension between professionalism and amateurism was a big part of it as well. But you start to get this sport, which in the UK becomes really part of the rise of cities and of industrialization and capitalism. In the United States, that happened to be baseball. That's the analog sport that sort of went along with that. But getting to the point where we start to see this sport become its own thing, which we know of as soccer, is they had to establish some rules. And one of the rules they started to establish was, all right, you can't use your hands, because I think that the sport was so amorphous that they would sometimes, schools who were, for example, competing this would have to decide on the rules before every match. And that becomes hard to compare what's happening from over time. You want to be able to create sort of a record with that. And so you have one sport that launches over to one side, which involves kicking, but it also involves handling the ball, involves tackling, and that's going to become rugby, and which is also going to become American football, or Canadian football, Australian rules football, Gaelic football is going to go on that stream of things. And then on the other side, you have association football or soccer, which is the sport that you can't tackle, although there's some version of that, but you can't wrap your arms around somebody and bring them down. That's supposed to be a penalty. You're not supposed to use your hands. Of course, a keeper can do that. And so that's where you get the division of these different sports that become rugby and sports like that from soccer. And so that's something that happens in the 1800s. And then in the late 1800s, we start to see the rise of professional teams that are around the sport as well.
Which is how you get like, I mean, I don't know exactly when sort of like all of the different teams started, but that's when you start to see like, Manchester United.
That's the classic example, right? It's a factory town.
Exactly.
And that's where industrialization started in this part of the world. And it starts as an amateur situation, and then it becomes a professional thing. And the United part is because there are a number of different teams, apparently, that became combined under one. And so that's the legacy of sort of the contemporary history, what merges into a modern sport is what I'm trying to say.
Right, and I think it goes to show that the sport is a very good comparison, or maybe just a good example of going back to sort of what we were talking about at the very beginning of this episode, which is our article on regionalism and identity through sport. And I think soccer in a lot of ways provided that initial outlet during this time of urbanism or urbanization, where people were moving to cities en masse.
That's right.
And then all of a sudden, prior to that, I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I don't think certainly the idea of like a city-based identity really existed all that well, at least not in the way we would think of it today, right? Like, if I'm obviously, we've talked about this before, Hunter and I are both here in Portland. I identify strongly as a Portlander. I identify, through the Portland Timbers. I identify through the Portland Trailblazers, two professional sports teams here. I don't think that identity or that idea of identity really existed prior to industrialization, which then I think naturally fed into people moving to cities, which then naturally fed into professional teams, which then naturally fed into this identity, right? It's like this cascading effect where people sort of built up these identities through their newfound living conditions.
That's right. And it's really hard to divorce this from the conversation of the rise of industrialization, the rise of capitalism, because a lot of this desire to create an identity around a city is boosterism. And the idea that, we have certain products, we have certain factories, we have certain headquarters and businesses that are located in a place. And that sport is one of the ways in which that is manifest and which becomes more tangible. And so, that's when people make that connection between the rise of industrialization and capitalism in sport, that's what they're talking about.
Right. And I think, so you hit on a keyword there, which I think leads perfectly into our next sort of segment, which is nationalism, which ties so perfectly into the World Cup and everything that the World Cup is really about. But first, let's talk a little bit about the term nationalism, because it's used in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think when we talk about nationalism, it's in the United States, I wonder if it sometimes has, it has all kinds of different connotations. Usually when you're talking about other places, it's bad. And when you're talking about your own place, it's okay.
Well, if you're talking about your own place, it's patriotism.
Right.
If you're talking about another place, it's nationalism, and that's bad, right? But they're essentially, they're they're very much like the same thing in my head.
It's the idea that there is something that makes a particular group of people distinct, and it's culturally based, which means it's probably linguistically based in some ways, although there's often many different languages that's spoken within a particular place. And then there could be a religion component to that. There is all kinds of popular culture, music and art and dance and cuisine all get wrapped up into that as well.
Right.
And nationalism, there's an argument to be made that it's a byproduct of the rise of capitalism. And there's a lot of critiques of capitalism that suggest that nationalism is a way of getting people to identify with people that they don't have a lot in common with across classes, when in fact who they should have things in common with are workers in different parts of the world. This would be sort of a classic orthodox Marxist argument to make. But yeah, so nationalism is a very loaded term, but that's what we're talking about, is the idea that there's a cultural connection that a group of people who identify with a particular territory have.
Right. And we talked a lot about this in our No Borders episode. So if you haven't listened to that, like you're interested in nationalism, this broad-based concept of how people identify with themselves, like go listen to that episode, because we talk a lot about that. But I think
that's right.
I think the big point here is that, and you touched on this a little bit, it's like, it's how are you comparing yourself with sort of your compatriots, your other people who live within sort of your artificial borders, for lack of a better word. And I think a lot of times people do tend to think of it in terms of a lot of aspects, but certainly in terms of linguistics. But that's not always true, because I think, if you look at India, which is having a nationalist moment right now, they have a lot of nationalism right now, and they broadly speak somewhere around 100 different languages in that country. So it's not always linguistically bound.
That's true.
And I think that's the only reason why I bring that up, is because I think by and large, that is one of the chief parts of what people will think of when they think of nationalism in a country.
Well, oftentimes a particular language is adopted as the language of nationalists. And so there's many examples of this.
And that's how you have the other. And then
let me just use Spain as an example, because a lot of my research, as I talked before, deals with that. And there are many languages that are spoken in Spain. And when you have particular leaders, dictators in particular in the 20th century, who are going to promote a particular idea, a more narrow idea of how you should define a national identity, oftentimes a particular language is going to be adopted at the expense of others as the language of the nation.
Right. And so let's tie this back into the World Cup, right? So like the World Cup is almost what's the right term for it? It would be like an appropriate way to express nationalism.
Right. The idea is, I think the idea was sport, and we have to mention the Olympics here, and we'll be talking about the Olympics a few different times throughout this podcast, but because the Olympics predates the World Cup, the idea is that sport would be a venue for people to express an idea of nationalism that doesn't involve war.
Right.
Right. And so that you would be able to have what would be more of a friendly competition. This is where amateurs usually comes into it as well, that you would have amateurs that would be participating as representatives of particular places, and that this is deemed perhaps a healthy way for people to have competition while at the same time coming together in a way to celebrate achievements, physical feats and mental and physical feats that go along with sports. And so if we look at the contemporary Olympics that restarted in 1896 after the ancient Olympics, that Olympic project was expressly put together as a moment for, and there was an individual from France who promoted this with the idea that this would be a way to gel a sense of French nationalism. And the World Cup has become a very similar thing, as that this would be a safe, so to speak, way for countries to compete with one another and experience nationalism. But the idea is that it wouldn't come at the expense of people's lives and things like that.
Right. So, and just so you know, we're going to talk a lot about the Olympics in part 2 of this episode. And so come back, listen to that episode.
That's right. Yeah. We're already foreshadowing that we're not going to be able to fit this into one episode.
Yeah. If you didn't know. Yeah. And then, but we've also started to see this through other sports right now. There's FIBA, which is like the national, or international, like basketball association. Right. And so now Like that's like the same sort of concepts trying to be like replicated in other sports.
For certain countries, the World Championship of Hockey is where an enormous amount of pride and
energy and
identity and effort goes into that. And so if you happen to be from Canada, the Czech Republic, or Russia, I mean, these are some of the places, Lithuania, Estonia, I think that hockey is an extremely important venue for the expression of identity.
Very important. Yeah. But let's get back to the World Cup and let's start talking about the history of the World Cup, men and women's.
All right. So FIFA, when we're talking about the World Cup, we're talking about a tournament that's sponsored by FIFA. And FIFA is an acronym that is the International Federation of Football Associations, but it's the French acronym because it was like the Olympics, started with the French viewpoint. And FIFA was founded in Paris in 1904. But before that, let's back up a little bit. There were some tournaments that were held that were certainly not global in extent, but that started to be the precursors of what we might call an international tournament that led to the World Cup. So from 1876 to 1905, there were English and Scottish teams, and these were club teams. These were not national teams that started meeting in what was sometimes billed as world championships. So that's sometimes pointed to as the sort of early incubator of something that might eventually emerge into be the World Cup. There's something called the Sir Thomas Lipton Trophy Tournament, was held in 1909 in Turin, held again in 1911. These also involved club teams, but these were attempts outside of the Olympics to have soccer tournaments that sort of had the trappings of what we might call a World Cup type of vibe. And I mean, it's almost impossible not to talk about the Olympics a little bit here, but the Olympic tournaments that were held early on in 1900 and 1904, this was the Paris and St. Louis Summer Olympics, had soccer as a demonstration sport. And which means it wasn't sort of an official sport. We still have sports that are tried out before they become official sports,
which we see today.
We see that as well,
right? Like there's always a couple new sports, and they usually try them out,
and maybe they get adopted.
Maybe they get adopted.
They don't.
Right? Yeah. Like I think if we Americanize this a little bit, I don't know where it's landed, but I know baseball was at one point part of the Olympics and has since went away, and now they're thinking about bringing it back, or maybe it is back.
And there is a world championship, and baseball is a sport that was established in the United States, but it has been the most popular sport in many other countries: Cuba, Puerto Rico, it's Venezuela, Japan, South Korea, I believe, as well, are places where baseball's had an enormous amount of purchase, an enormous amount of pride. Now, FIFA, which I mentioned, established in 1904, hosted a tournament in 1906, which was an international soccer tournament. And by most accounts that I was able to look at, it was somewhat of a disaster. It didn't really come together that well. And then FIFA also was involved in being the organizing body that was involved in some of the Olympic competitions. But it was in 1930 that there was the first edition of something that we call the World Cup, hosted by FIFA, was held. And this was a tournament that was held in Uruguay. And there was limited participation. I think there were 13 different countries that participated in this tournament. The different parts of the UK, which have their own football associations, didn't participate because they thought that this was not something that they organized, so that they didn't want to suggest that this would be something they supported. And also simply transporting athletes to Uruguay circa 1930 was complicated enough that it was pretty difficult. But anyways, Uruguay won that first tournament. They defeated Argentina 4-2. And when we look at the history books that talk about the history of the World Cup, that's the one that usually gets named first.
All right, which is a big, like, I mean, it was a long time ago, but that's like a very momentous part of Uruguayan identity, is that they won the very first World Cup.
That's right.
Right?
That's huge. And like Uruguay is actually one not a little known fact, but something that people in the United States might not be acutely aware of, is that Uruguay won their second World Cup in 1950 when it was hosted in Brazil.
Right.
And so that was a tournament that Brazil, was.
Well, I was just going to say, which I think was only the third World Cup.
That was the fourth World Cup.
Oh, fourth.
Yeah,
so a couple of them didn't have them because of World War II.
That's right. A couple were canceled because of World War II. So you had the 1930, it was hosted in Uruguay. 1934, it was hosted in Italy, in which Italy won, defeated Czechoslovakia. So the first two hosts of the World Cup won. So hosting the World Cup is helpful.
Yeah.
1938, the tournament was hosted in France. Italy won. And then we had to take off some time because the World War was fought and there was no way to hold an international tournament like that. In 1950, South America, it's brought back to South America. Brazil is the host. They're in the final and they lose to Uruguay 2-1. From there, it goes to Switzerland in 1954. West Germany, the team known as West Germany at the time, is the winner. 1958, Sweden, the host, make the final but lose to Brazil. And then Chile, 1962, Brazil wins. So Brazil at that point has won 2, Italy has won 2, and Uruguay has won 2 as of 1962. And then in 1966, it goes to England, and England is the host, and they win. They win against West Germany, 4-2 in overtime. We could go down the list here, but anyways.
I think the point is that nobody's won the Men's World Cup outside of Europe and South America.
That's true. There's been only 8 countries period that have won the Men's World Cup in 21 World Cups.
So and I kind of hate saying this because I'm a big USA fan. I love watching the World Cup. I always pull for the USA. I'm American through and through. Unfortunately, your country is not likely to win the World Cup anytime soon.
Right now,
unless you're within one of these 8 countries, and really, it's only maybe 5 countries.
We have to play the games, but that's not. The United States is not odds-on favorite to do particularly well in 2022 here. So to break it down, there have been 8 different countries that have won in the 21 tournaments so far. Again, 2022 is the 22nd tournament. Brazil has won 5. Germany has won 4 times. Italy has also won 4 times. Argentina, France, and Uruguay have won twice apiece. And then England and Spain have won 1. And that's the list.
But that's the Men's World Cup.
That's the Men's World Cup. So the Women's World Cup is a different situation entirely.
And in my opinion, I love the World Cup in general. I love both the Women's and the Men's World Cup. I think the Women's World Cup is a lot more entertaining for the fact that, well, if I can be a little selfish here, the U.S. women's team has been really dominant.
If you like to see your team win and you're from the United States, you might be a fan of the Women's World Cup because the United States has won 4 of the 8 tournaments so far.
They've won 4 of the 8, but it's like Japan had a really good team one year, right? It's just been more interesting, right? I'm like, with the Men's World Cup, I'm kind of tired about hearing about Germany and Italy and Spain and England and Brazil and Argentina, right? Those are typically those are the
teams that are usually named as the favorites. Yeah. They might be the odd-on favorites this time. Let's talk a little bit about the Women's World Cup. And let's talk about women's soccer. Now, women's soccer is fantastically popular in the United States, but it's not the only place in the world where women's soccer is popular. It's popular in many different places. And if you go back, women's soccer was extremely popular in the UK in the 1920s. There's teams and matches I've been reading about attracting crowds of 50,000. And so really large groups of people coming out to check out this sport, women's soccer. And something happened that really curtailed the popularity or the ability of women's soccer clubs to compete in England in particular was when the Football Association there, which is commonly called the FA, banned women's soccer on grounds belonging to their member clubs from 1920 into either 1969 or 1970. So the sport was really popular, and all of a sudden there's a ban put on it, which wasn't a ban on the sport, but most of the grounds were associated with the Football Association, so it became very difficult for teams to find a place to compete. They had to compete on rugby grounds and things like this. And so there was a moment where there was an intervention to purposely make it more difficult for women to play this sport in the UK.
I think it just goes to show that you take away regardless of how popular something is, if you take away the resources that are being able to support it, right, which is in this case the popular areas that people associate with the sport and people would go to see the sport, you take that away, it's going to suck the air out of
and it makes it
the growth.
Very difficult for that to happen.
Yeah.
I think. So there, just another couple of examples. Similar bans existed in other countries. In Germany from 1955 to 1970, and Brazil from 1941 to 1979, where there was made difficult for women to compete. Not because it wasn't because there was an interest. There was interest. It wasn't because there wasn't teams. There were teams. But the organization that was in charge of administering the sport in these countries made it difficult for that to happen.
Yeah.
So if we want to talk about the oldest international tournament for women's soccer, we talk about the AFC Women's Asian Cup, which began in 1975. And that's oldest in terms of ongoing. And the country where women's soccer was first professionalized, as far as I can tell from some of the research I've done, was Italy in the 1970s. There was a World Cup that was not sanctioned. There's 2 World Cups not sanctioned by FIFA, but rather by the Federation of Independent European Female Football. So this was involving European teams, but I think some other teams as well, because the first one was held in Italy in 1970. Denmark defeated Italy 2-0. But the second one was held in Mexico in 1971. This was Denmark defeating Mexico 3-0 at the Azteca in front of 110,000 people. So, the interest in women's soccer is by no means new. The patriarchy put a kibosh on that and made it very difficult for that to happen. And we're still seeing struggles in the United States and other places with inequalities that are being addressed. Yeah. But, it's important to state that things could have been different.
Things could have been a lot different. And Hunter, I know there's a lot more to say on Women's World Cup and soccer and everything. We might have to push that to part 2 because we are almost at an hour and a half right now.
Is that right? All right. Well, maybe we should pick it up there because there is more to say about that.
There's so much more to say.
This is the cliffhanger that will bring people back to tune in next week when we continue our conversation and get to the question of what if there was no World Cup?
Exactly. So come back. We're going to continue talking about the women's soccer and women's World Cup because it's part of this conversation of what if there was no World Cup, right? There's 2 World Cups out there. And then we're also going to talk more about the Olympics, and then we're going to get into our speculation. It should be a lot of fun. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode.
Please come back.
Come back. Yeah, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.